Good morning. Welcome to Faith for Living, Day 2, with Dr. Lisa Wolf from Oklahoma City University. We're happy to welcome Lisa and her family here to Lakeside this week, and also Lisa's sister, Katie Wolf, who comes to us from Knoxville, Tennessee, and indeed the University of Tennessee, where she teaches voice, and you will see why in a few moments. I would like to mention to you this morning again that Lisa's book, Ruth, Esther, the Song of Songs, and Judith, is on sale at the Fine Print Bookstore, and also her new volume on Koheleth, which just came out in March. Dr. Wolf is a graduate of United Theological Seminary, received her PhD at Northwestern and Garrett Theological Seminary in Chicago, and she's been teaching for the last several years at Oklahoma City University and also at St. Paul School of Theology. We're happy to have her here this week, and I think we were planning on a book signing, but since folks may not have had time to get the book, maybe we'll do that tomorrow. We'll do that tomorrow on the porch of the hotel, so keep that in mind. Let me also invite you to Vespers this evening right here at the Steele Memorial Bandstand, where Dr. Wolf will be our preacher, and Katie will be leading us in several songs. And that'll be a good time of fellowship together. I've been told that the rain has passed us, according to the radar, and so we're going to trust that that's true both this morning and this evening. And should we have a challenge tomorrow morning, the presentation will be live streamed from Orchestra Hall, but we won't be able to gather. But stay tuned, and the Lakeside app will let you know which direction we have to move according to the weather. So at this time, I would like to invite Katie Wolf to come forward and lead us in an opening song of her choice.
Charlie said, "You want to sing?" And I said, "Sure." So this is the song that was on my heart this morning as I was watching sunrise at the beautiful shore of Lake Erie. This is a Charles Dickens poem set by Lee Dengler. The pure, the bright, the beautiful that stirred our hearts in youth, the impulses to wordless prayer, the streams of love and truth, the longing after something lost, the spirit's yearning cry, the striving after better hopes. These things shall never die. These things shall never die. A timid hand stretched forth to aid a sister in her need. A kindly word in grief's dark hour that proves a friend indeed. The plea for mercy softly breathed when justice threatens high. The sorrow of a contrite heart. These things shall never die, shall never die. Let nothing pass, for every hand must find some work to do. Lose not a chance to waken love. Be firm and just and true. So shall a light that cannot fade beam on thee from on high, and angel voices say to thee, these things can never die, these things can never die.
Thank you, my wonderful sister, Katie. Good morning, Lakeside. I am again delighted to be here today to teach about some victory stories in the book of Judges, chapters 4 and 5. I had originally titled this Uppity Warriors, and so I'll clarify about that word uppity, which I have been doing some research on recently and had learned that it has a terrible history as a racial slur, which is not how I intend to use it. I am using uppity as someone who practices assertive resistance, intentionally working to destroy any circumscribed social roles, including their own. Thus, it may become a badge of courage and a term that would supersede its racist past. So you may determine how we do on that. And what I plan to do is give you a little background on Judges and then dive us into these chapters. I'll read some verses, comment a bit, and work through them that way. And if you want to follow along on the New Revised Standard Version, a helpful place to go on your phone, on your browser is oremus.org, oremus.org has the New Revised Standard Version. So Judges arises in the larger history of the Bible after the creation, after the ancestors, after the enslavement in Egypt, after the Exodus event, after the wandering in the wilderness, and then the people have finally gotten to the so-called Promised Land. I always call it the so-called Promised Land because like the so-called New World that some of us refer to as our home, it's a loaded term because there were people who already lived there. I'll try to unpack that a little bit more as we go along. So this is the time that I like to refer to by two terms. Often it's called the time of the settlement or the conquest. Now I gave you my other term. Instead of just conquest, I refer to this as conquest/settlement or conquest and settlement. The thing is that if we read the texts of Joshua and Judges closely, in other words, all of them and not just the Battle of Jericho, we can see clearly that the biblical texts themselves indicate there was not just widespread destruction of the people and places that were already in Canaan or the so-called Promised Land. There are reports of, well, we lived alongside the people, or we didn't destroy this whole town, and one place it says we destroyed this town, and then another place it said they destroyed it under a different time period. So the texts are a little bit mixed up, and frankly, so is the archaeological history. So I like to refer to this time period as the conquest and settlement period, just to keep in mind that we're not exactly sure what went down, but it probably was not nearly as simplistic as we may have been led to believe just by singing the Joshua Fit the Battle of Jericho song. No offense against that song. Now, the other thing is, if you know any stories from the book of Judges, let's give that a try. Can anybody think of a story from the book of Judges? No fair naming any of these right here. Can you think of anything from Judges? Samson and Delilah, there's one. That's a popular one. Did you have one in the back? She said Samson too, okay. That's one of the more well-known ones. We've got Gideon there. That's another one that some people know. There are a lot of stories in Judges that people don't really know. That's okay. But you can remedy that. That's all I'm saying. Now, if you were to read the whole book of Judges, chapters 1 through 19, I think it is, all the way through, you would notice something that you would not notice if you just read one of the Judges' stories, say Samson. And that is, there's an editorial framework that has been placed on the book of Judges, or that pre-existed. And here's how the framework goes. It's some scholars refer to it as the Judges cycle because it's a repeating editorial framework. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. The anger of the Lord was kindled. They were punished by a foreign power who the Lord sent to punish them because they had been evil in the sight of the Lord. Then they cry out for help to the Lord, and the Lord sends a judge who delivers them. And after the judge delivers them, then the land has rest, and it starts over again with the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Now, if you're curious about this or skeptical and you want to check my work, you can look in Judges chapter 3, where we meet the judge Othniel. And right at the beginning of 3, you can really see that cycle laid out. So what many scholars think has happened in Judges is that there were these pre-existing hero stories about people like Othniel and Deborah and Gideon and other judges who we meet, Samson in this book, and those hero stories were slotted into this editorial framework that makes up the whole book. So I just want to point that out, that that's what's going on overall in the book of Judges. So we'll hear a little of that. I'm going to start in Judges chapter 4, and I'll go a little bit, and then I'll comment a little bit. And I also would really like to invite you to just jump in with raising your hand if you have a question at some point that's confusing to you, or some idea or thought pops into your head, and I think that might be kind of fun. So you're welcome to do that if you like, and if not, I mean, I'm a professor, I can talk all day. So the Israelites, again, did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. So the Lord sold them into the hand of King Jabin of Canaan, who reigned in Hatzor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help, for he had 900 chariots of iron and had oppressed the Israelites cruelly for 20 years. So that's the end of 4:3. Let me pause for just a second. Chariots of iron, as one of my professors at United, Tom Dozeman, said to my class many years ago, this was the nuclear weapon of the time. And in fact, in Joshua, Judges, and Samuel and Kings, iron and who controlled iron, who had iron, was a major issue in this time period, because if you had iron chariots, you could usually win the battle. Now, not always, as we saw with that whole thing in the Reed Sea and the escape from Egypt, where the chariots got stuck in the mud, and then it was bad for them. So anyway, this is all to say, Sisera is a very scary foe, and he had oppressed the Israelites cruelly for 20 years. Now, verse 4, at that time, Deborah, a prophetess, wife of Lapidot, was judging Israel. Now, let me make a little comment about this verse about Deborah. My colleague, Will Gaffney, who is on your bibliography, who wrote Womanist Midrash, she gives her own translation of this verse. Deborah, a woman, a female prophet, a fiery woman, she was judging. So in her translation, she highlights how the verse in Hebrew mentions her femaleness really 3 times. And the fiery woman part is what NRSV translates wife of Lapidot. So most English translations make that sound like it's referring to her husband, but that is not a certain translation. It could also be, or instead be, a reference to her character. This name, it seems like it could be a name, Lapidot, or it could be a reference to her as a fiery woman. The Hebrew says, woman of name in order to, which usually gets translated wife of so-and-so. So here, woman of Lapidote could be a fiery woman instead. So there we've met Deborah, and notably, there are some bugs chewing on my ankles. Sorry. Notably, the text does not come out and say, and she's the only female judge in this book. It does seem to highlight her femaleness, but it does not express specific shock. So we'll just sit with that for a minute. So she used to sit, verse 5, under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites came up to her for judgment. She sent and summoned Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take position at Mount Tabor, bringing 10,000 from the tribe of Naphtali and the tribe of Zebulun. I will draw out Sisera, the general of Yabin's army, to meet you by the Wadi Kishon with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand." So Deborah's calling on Barak. Somebody's bringing me bug spray, so that's very nice. Thank you. All right. You got to do what you got to do. So thank you. So Deborah's calling on this other person, Barak, to help her in this battle. And she brings this as a word from the Lord, as a prophet would do. And to work together to draw out Sisera, the enemy commander, the guy with the iron chariots, and to try to defeat him in battle. Verse 8, Barak said to her, I really enjoy this verse, by the way. Barak said to her, "If you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go." So we see who is the one to, count on in this story, and that is Deborah. And Barak feels okay if she's going to be along, and because she's suggesting they split up, but it sounds like he wants to stay with her. She says, "I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman." Now, there's some debate about this phrase. Is this simply stated as fact? The Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman, which we will see is what happens by the end of this story, spoiler. Or is this some kind of a slam to Barak's honor? Well, we don't know. That's the bummer when you don't get facial expressions or tone of voice in some of these statements in the Bible. This is interestingly very similar to a phrase we see repeatedly in the book of Judith, which if you've never read the book of Judith, you should do so right away. Just saying. All right, end of verse 9. Then Deborah got up and went with Barak to Kadesh. Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali, those are tribes, to Kadesh, and 10,000 warriors went up behind him, and Deborah went up with him. This is a parenthetical, verse 11. Now, Heber the Kenite had separated from the other Kenites, that is, the descendants of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses. So this is taking us back all the way to Exodus with the Kenites, the tribe into which Moses married. And Heber the Kenite is who we're meeting here. He had encamped as far away as Elon Bezananim, which is near Kadesh. This is foreshadowing. We'll meet Heber the Kenite again in a little bit. When Sisera was told that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor, Sisera called out all his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the troops who were up with him, from Harosheth Hagoyim to the Wadi Kishon. Then Deborah said to Barak, this is the war cry, "Up! For this is the day on which the Lord has given Sisera into your hand. The Lord is indeed going out before you." So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 warriors following him. And the Lord threw Sisera and all his chariots and all his army into a panic before Barak. Sisera got down from his chariot and fled away on foot, while Barak pursued the chariots and the army to Harosheth Hagoyim. All the army of Sisera fell by the sword. No one was left. Now let me pause. That was the end of 16. Did anybody notice who is repeatedly given credit for the victory here? Barak, but besides him, the Lord is indeed going out before you. The Lord has given Sisera into your hand. Now, we're going to come back to this as an ethical, theological problem/issue. But it's really very important for understanding the theology of this book and some of the other books in the Hebrew Bible to note that all the credit here is given to the Lord. So the people were being punished by the Lord, and now the people are being delivered by the Lord, and the victory that Barak has and Deborah have won is attributed to the Lord. So I just wanted to highlight that. Now, 17, we're getting to the juicy part. Now, Sisera had fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, wife of Heber the Kenite, for there was peace between King Jabin of Hatzor and the clan of Heber the Kenite. So Heber the Kenite had apparently been an ally of the troops of Sisera and the king of Jabin, against whom Deborah and Barak were fighting. So it seems that Sisera is fleeing to a tent that he would rightfully imagine is occupied by an ally of his, a safe place. But Heber the Kenite is not home. So verse 18, Jael came out to meet Sisera and said to him, oh, I should just say something because Jael starts with a J. So my sister Katie reminded me that most people would say Jael or Jael, and it's okay. You can say it that way. That's the English way to say it. But in Hebrew, you would say it Jael. It's always complicated when people say, how do you pronounce this? Well, I mean, usually in English, people say it this way, but in Hebrew, you would say it this way. And so, just say it with confidence. That's my advice. So Jael came out to meet Sisera and said to him, turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me, have no fear. So he turned aside to her into the tent, and she covered him with a rug, presumably like a blanket in a nap scenario. And then he said to her, please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty. So she opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him. Now we're in verse 20. He said to her, stand at the entrance of the tent, and if anybody comes and asks you, is anyone here? Say no. But Jael, wife of Heber, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand and went softly, or another good translation of the Hebrew here is sneakily, to him and drove the peg into his temple until it went down into the ground. He was lying fast asleep from weariness, and he died. So that's kind of a graphic scene. Some really fascinating things in there, right? He asks for water. She gives him milk, maybe to make him a little bit sleepy. Why did she do that? We're going to talk about that in a little while. Also, here's something very interesting. I've been studying for many years women in the Hebrew Bible, and there's a book by Jenny Ebeling, Ebeling, who it's about ancient Israelite women, and I think she was the one who pointed out that in the ancient Near East, women put the tents up. That was women's work. I don't know why, but anyway, it was. So the upshot there is a woman would have been good with a tent peg and a mallet. Ron's laughing. I know. There is it's humorous in a, shadowy sort of way. So, yeah, and I think ancient audiences would have been laughing too. So you're in good company, in my opinion. All right. Then in 22, as Barak came in pursuit of Sisera, Jael went out to meet him and said to him, "Come, and I will show you the man whom you are seeking." So he went into her tent, and there was Sisera lying dead with the tent peg in his temple. So on that day, God subdued King Jabin of Canaan before the Israelites. Then the hand of the Israelites bore harder and harder on King Jabin of Canaan until they destroyed King Jabin of Canaan. So that's the end of chapter 4. And one of the things that I want to point out is that this is a prose version of the story. It's written as a narrative. And when I flip my sheet of highly notated biblical passage, or when you move your screen up or turn the page in your Bible to chapter 5, we'll see a really fascinating but kind of odd thing, which is that chapter 5 tells us essentially the same story as a song or a poem. So this story of Deborah and Barak and Jael and Sisera gets double billing twice in a row. And this is a rather unusual and very notable situation. We see it also in Exodus 14 and 15. Exodus 14 tells the story about the Exodus coming through the Reed Sea, escaping from the Egyptians as narrative. And Exodus 15 tells it as a song or a story. And a little commercial here, I'll be speaking a little bit about that passage, and in particular, Miriam's song in chapter 15 of Exodus this evening at Vespers. So here's Judges 5, the poem form of this story. And I'm going to cut a little bit out of the middle just for the sake of time. Then Deborah and Barak, son of Abinoam, sang on that day, saying, "When locks are long in Israel, when the people offer themselves willingly, bless the Lord. Hear, O kings, give ear, O princes, to the Lord I will sing. I will make melody to the Lord, the God of Israel. Lord, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the reign of Edom, the earth trembled, and the heavens poured. The clouds indeed poured water. The mountains quaked before the Lord, the one of Sinai, before the Lord, the God in Israel." Let me break just for a second there. Those verses 4 and 5, we hear all creation celebrating this victory. And this is a feature that we see in not only ancient Israelite writing, but in other ancient Near Eastern writings, that any really great deity is going to have all of creation celebrating along with them or joining in their battles. And so here we see that with the earth trembling, the heavens pouring, the clouds pouring water, and the mountains quaking. Okay, verse 6. And this may have been kind of the way they told the story is this. In the days of Shamgar, son of Anat, in the days of Jael, caravans ceased, and travelers kept to the byways. The peasantry prospered in Israel. They grew fat on plunder because you arose, Deborah, arose as a mother in Israel. And that verse about the peasantry may suggest that there's some kind of not only a battle scene between warring nations, but it also suggests economic differentiation. There were those rich enemies who had the iron chariots, and then there were the poor people, and we've got a reversal of fortunes. Verse 8, when new gods were chosen, Then war was in the gates. Was shield or spear to be seen among 40,000 in Israel? My heart goes out to the commanders of Israel who offered themselves willingly among the people. Bless the Lord. Tell of it, you who ride on white donkeys, you who sit on rich carpets, and you who walk by the way. To the sound of musicians at the watering places, there they repeat the triumphs of the Lord, the triumphs of his peasantry in Israel. Then down to the gates marched the people of the Lord. Awake, awake, Deborah, awake, awake, utter a song. Arise, Barak, lead away your captives, O son of Abinoam. That's one of the parts that's so poetic, and the repetition makes me think, how did they set this to music? This was probably a little folk song that everybody knew, but we don't know the tune anymore, so somebody will have to make it up. Then down marched the remnant of the noble. The people of the Lord marched down for him against the mighty. And then in verses 14 through 18, which I'm going to skip, we get a rehearsal of 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel and an accounting of whether they helped or whether they stood by. Did they respond well in helping out with the battle, or did they bail on helping the other tribes? So it raises the question, who will help, who did help, and who will not? And it probably contained some ancient Israelite stereotypes from the point of view of whoever was writing this song about the tribes we like and the tribes we don't like. I mean, you can think about football team rivalries if you want, or what have you. So picking up in verse 19, the kings came, they fought. Then fought the kings of Canaan at Tanakh by the waters of Megiddo. They got no spoils of silver. The stars fought from heaven. From their courses they fought against Sisera. The torrent Kishon swept them away. The ongoing torrent, the torrent Kishon. March on, my soul, with might. And here again, beautifully poetic words that could easily be set to song. And also, again, we get the all creation singing along this victory song. March on, my soul, with might. Then loud beat the horses' hoofs with galloping, galloping of his steeds. Curse Meroz, says the angel of the Lord. Curse bitterly its inhabitants, because they did not come to the help of the Lord, against the mighty. Now, 24, we get the blessing of Jael. Most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, of tent-dwelling women most blessed. He asked water, and she gave him milk. She brought him curds in a lordly bowl. She put her hand to the tent peg, and her right hand to the workman's mallet. She struck Sisera a blow. She crushed his head. She shattered and pierced his temple. He sank. He fell, he lay still at her feet. At her feet he sank, he fell where he sank. There he fell dead. Which sounds almost silly and redundant to just say it, but imagine it in a song where you get those kinds of repetitions. Out of the window, now this is a little bit of a shift in scene. I should note, it's striking, this blessing of Jael, and it connects to a few other blessings of biblical women. So one is Ruth, who gets a blessing like that, and then Abigail in 1 Samuel 25, and then Judith in the book of Judith, which I will tell you again, you should read if you have not. It's in the Apocrypha. At the very end of the book, we get this song to Judith and a blessing. So here's our little shift. Out of the window she peered, verse 28, the mother of Sisera. Remember, he's the guy with the tent peg in his temple. Out of the window she peered, the mother of Sisera gazed through the lattice. Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why tarry the hoofbeats of his chariots? Her wisest ladies made answer. Indeed, she answers the question herself. Are they not finding and dividing the spoil? A girl or two for every man, which sounds bad, but the Hebrew is actually worse. It says, a womb or two for every man. Now we may have some insight to Jael's motive. Spoil of dyed stuffs for Sisera, spoil of dyed stuffs embroidered, 2 pieces of dyed work embroidered for my neck as spoil. So perish all your enemies, O Lord. But may your friends be like the sun as it rises in its might. And the land had rest for 40 years. There we pick up the editorial framework again. So I highlighted most of the things I wanted to say there. I want to make a little point of comparison that in the narrative version of this story in 4:19, we get this verse that says, then he said to her, this is Sisera talking to Jael, please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty. So she opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him. And then in contrast, in 5:24 and 25, most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, of tent-dwelling women most blessed. He asked water, and she gave him milk. She brought him curds in a lordly bowl. So when we get 2 chapters side by side, or 2 fairly lengthy versions of the same event, it points to the importance of that event for the biblical authors. And also, whenever we have a song or a poem, it tends to point to it as a very ancient piece of literature that was probably long preceded in oral form. Think of a traveling bard who, before there was Netflix and cool stuff, or even books, a traveling bard who would move around town to town and sing epic songs and tell stories. Think of a Beowulf and Gilgamesh. And here we have a little saved story over many, many centuries about Deborah and Jael and Barak and Sisera. And so it points to how important this story was to our ancestors in faith, and especially that song. Some scholars have proposed that Judges 5, the song version of this story, may be one of the oldest parts of the Hebrew Bible. In other words, that the story that came before it was told long before any other story in the Hebrew Bible that we have retained, and that maybe it was written down long before anything else. Now, I want to go back to the question that I'm hoping you all are puzzling over, maybe more than this question, and maybe it's a different one. So if I get the wrong question, you can stop me and say, no, I had this question instead. But the question I'm thinking of is, why did Jael kill Sisera? Do you want to hazard a guess? You do? No, you just want to know what I think. Yeah? Okay. That's what I got myself into here. Okay. So, and the puzzling part is because Jael is the wife of a guy who's supposed to be an ally of Sisera. So it seems logical that he would have expected that to be a safe place, Jael's tent. But Jael is a woman alone in this tent, and especially the phrase in chapter 5 in the poem that tells us what Sisera's mother expected would have been happening to the women who she expected Sisera had defeated. What was that? I told you, a womb for every man, a womb or two for every man, indicates the high likelihood of sexual violence following an expected defeat. And so it may well be that Jael felt she was at great personal risk with this man coming to her tent. Maybe even more so, given the fact that she was expected to have been an ally of his. And so perhaps she was eliminating him before he could attack her. Maybe she was defending herself. Now, there are a few other hints in the text, especially in the poem part, that spell out, in verse 27, it spells out that Sisera repeatedly says, he lay still at her feet he sank, he fell, where he sank, there he fell dead. And so some scholars have suggested that indicates, again, it subtly, euphemistically indicates that she felt at great personal risk in this situation with Sisera coming to her tent, so that it was about self-defense in relation to her own safety. Now, I also don't want to discount the thing that I think Ron was laughing at, and that is Jael becomes really a trickster figure in this passage, right? She gives him doesn't give him the thing he asked for. He asks for water. She gives him milk. He falls asleep. She sneaks over to him, and she drives a tent peg through his temple. And you're not really expecting that to be what comes in the text. So I think, and there's a place for trickster figures. We have lots of them in the biblical narratives. And so I think we can categorize Jael that way too, and think about that a little bit. Now, I also want to highlight that a lot of people go to the Bible and expect it always to be prescriptive. In other words, we may expect the Bible to tell us how we should behave. And I don't think that's probably the message with Jael. I think it's more about a warning of what might happen if you go against God's people. I think that's probably more of what's going on here. So we also have some indications of kind of a power to the peasants with the guy with all these iron chariots and the reference to the peasants in the song. And so one of the things that I like to keep in mind when I'm struggling with some of the ethical issues related to violent biblical texts is that these were most likely passages, stories told and written by people who were the underdogs, who probably could not have won a battle like this in historical reality. One scholar has talked about the book of Esther as, and the violence at the book of Esther as kind of a release valve for a people who they could not destroy or defeat their enemies that way. But what they could do is tell great stories about defeating their enemies, and somehow that would make them feel better. This is a great example of why I think it's very difficult for contemporary Americans in particular to read the Bible and get the right idea. Because for the most part, we cannot relate to what it is like to be the small underdog country or nation that lacks military resources and that lacks financial resources, that everybody's always picking on, and that we can never defend ourselves. That is not who we are. We don't know what it's like, for the most part, to have people shooting at us and to be vulnerable in that way and to be fearing for our lives in that way. Now, some people do know what that's like. I should for sure say. But I think overall, Americans in this century, we don't have a lot of personal experience with that. And so I think that makes it, for some of us, either more troubling to read these violent passages, or it can become justification, wrongly so, for us to swing around our power and might. And so I think those are important things to remember. I sometimes tell my students, if you're worried about or troubled by a warrior God, and that's what we get here, and we get that in lots of parts of the Hebrew Bible. If you're troubled by a warrior God, what you need to first do is pause and feel really grateful that you don't need a warrior God. Because a people who are small and getting picked on and defeated and they can't defend themselves, they need a warrior God. And that's who they're going to call on and worship and praise. And that's not our experience. And so I think that's a really important thing to remember when we read these ethically troubling texts of divinely sanctioned violence. So another way to think of a text like this, a war victory text, is as a self-defense fantasy. I mentioned briefly, we can't really historically prove that this happened. And there have been some attempts, and one archaeologist thinks he found the encampment of Sisera and his army, but there's no way to say that this happened the way that we see it reported in the text. It may or may not have, but it could have been a self-defense fantasy for a group of people who could not defend themselves. And I think there's a place for victory stories for people who are in the position of the oppressed. So if you're just joining us today, or just seeing this online, I've been talking about some links to these stories to the Black Lives Matter movement, and I've been thinking about victory stories that are relevant here. For myself, as a white woman, I'll tell you what I relate to, and that is Xena Warrior Princess. Now, if you never heard of Xena Warrior Princess, you can use Google for that. But she could for sure defend herself. And she did so in a very compassionate way. She was always, caring for the underdogs. But nobody was going to hurt her or threaten her or scare her or defeat her. And I found that a very liberating show to watch. I'll just have to admit that. And I think that to me relates to maybe how these stories in Judges 4 and 5 felt for ancient Israel to tell and retell and sing. And for Black Lives Matter, what I was thinking of was this film that came out in 2018 called Black Panther. Now, I've seen the film a couple of times. I really loved it. Maybe you haven't seen it, so I'll give you a little summary. So Black Panther is part of the Marvel family of films, in other words, superheroes. You can also get Black Panther comics, which are written by Ta-Nehisi Coates, who writes for The Atlantic and who wrote the groundbreaking article about reparations that I mentioned yesterday. So Black Panther is a superhero who comes from a civilization in Africa called Wakanda. And Wakanda is a technologically advanced society that has such great technology that they can kind of hide themselves in this bubble from the rest of the world so that the rest of the world thinks they're a third world country. But in fact, they're very powerful, they're very advanced, and they send out these undercover agents all around the world, including to America, to try to help the oppressed of those other poor nations in the country who aren't so advanced. So the cast is almost entirely Black, from many different countries in Africa and from Black actors in America, and really fascinating storyline of them especially helping these other countries. And so I think the movie creatively addresses some of these same issues of violence and conflict through the lens of race. And I did some reading on this book, on this movie, and as I was reading, I realized some things that hadn't been quite so obvious to me when I just watched the movie, that Black Panther imagines a world where the initial violence against Africa did not occur, where that fear was not necessary, where the only distance was for protection rather than exclusion. So instead of a self-defense fantasy by an underdog people, it was a fantasy of a people who were never made into the underdogs. And one commentator wrote on this, and this is in your bibliography sheet, Van Newkirk wrote, the very idea of a global African diaspora creates the most fertile grounds for a field of what-ifs. What if European enslavers and colonizers had never ventured into the African continent? More intriguing yet, what if African nations and peoples had successfully rebuffed generations of plunder and theft? What if the Zulu had won the wars against the Voortrekkers and the British, and a confederation of Bantu people had risen up and smashed Belgian rule? What if the transatlantic children of the mother continent had been allowed to remain, building their empires with the bounties of the cradle of civilization? So the co-writer of the comic books had said this: he viewed Wakanda as the representation of an unbroken chain of achievement of Black excellence that never got interrupted by colonialism. So in other words, the movie imagines, and the comic books, what if the transatlantic slave trade had never happened? What if social status, technological advancement, and enemy lines were not immediately recognizable according to skin color? And what if truly assisting other countries with their struggles were a primary value to civilization? So I put those questions out to you as something for you to think about, hopefully sort of intriguing, and to connect back to Deborah and Jael. I think maybe we can imagine with their story, well, what if King Jabin of Canaan and the commander of his army, Sisera, had not oppressed the Israelites cruelly for 20 years? And in turn, what if the African countries had not been colonized? And how can we help undo what was done? So I'll end there and leave a few minutes for comments or questions if you have any. And I think we have a microphone over here. There's a question in the back. Thanks.
Yes, the Hebrew reference to Jael covering him up, I believe that I've heard that covering up is maybe a reference to actual sexual intercourse. Is there a possibility, I mean, comment on it if you will, is there a possibility that she was actually seeking his power or seeking to take from him before driving the peg into his head?
Well, I don't have the Hebrew in front of me, but there are several articles about the possible euphemistic uses of language, especially in chapter 5, about what may have happened prior to Jael killing him. And I can imagine those going various ways. Whether she was seeking his power or whether she was seeking, I'm sort of inclined to wonder if she was seeking her own protection or even getting revenge after having been attacked by him as a possibility. But you are right that covering and uncovering has absolutely been euphemistically used in other cases in the Hebrew Bible. I would need to look at the exact word to line that up. But I think you're thinking on the right track. And I think this is one of many, many cases in the biblical text where there's some assumption that the earliest audiences would have made that is kind of lost on us as readers separated by thousands of years. And it could have even been a gesture on the part of the storyteller. If you say she covered him up or he fell at her feet or, the nudge thing. Sometimes if a story is in oral form, the storyteller can communicate things that won't necessarily come through when it's written down. And so I think that's absolutely possible, yeah. The song talks about, that's a good point. The song doesn't comment on the covering. And the falling at the feet. Yeah, right. Okay, we have another question.
More of a comment. I was thinking that if this is the Lord's battle, I'm trying to see it from a greater view, and certainly Sisera could have been killed in the battle, but for some reason he was allowed to escape. And he ends up at one of the tribes of Israel who has separated itself from the main group. And could it have been an act of redemption that Jael performed by killing this man, that they too took part in the battle? And so God's plan to reunite Israel, this tribe that had come apart, the lost sheep, is now brought back into the fold because they actually killed the number one guy. They returned in a big way, not just some soldier.
Okay, that's really good. So she's talking about the Kenites, who we had that little parenthetical in chapter 4 about. Now the Kenites had, Hebrew the Kenite had separated from the other Kenites, that is the descendants of Hobab. So the Kenites have this relationship to Moses, but and so then there could be sort of a problem on the part of the editor in terms of, or the people wanting to understand, do we still have a connection to the Kenites or not? And then this story solves that problem. Now, so my scholar brain is going a little nuts here trying to do the math. And this little detail isn't something I have really studied in great depth. But in terms of chronology, it seems to me more likely that the reference to the Kenites in Exodus actually came after this song and is another way to write the Kenites into the story after the fact, whereas they were already in the Israelites' story because of Deborah's song, which came first. I'll talk a little bit about that chronology stuff tonight when I talk about Miriam's song too, but that's a really good instinct and great detailed reading. I love that.